Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello. Thank you for attending today's Career Coach webinar, How to Nail the Job Interview and Land More Job Offers. Please be sure to mute your computer microphone and phone during this webinar. My name is Dana Day, and I'm the Manager of Member Relations here at ASCM. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. This presentation is being recorded and will be available at apix.org/careercoach. At the end of the presentation, we will have time for a question and answer session. If you look at the toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click send. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Rodney Apple. Rodney is the founder and president of SCM Talent Group, LLC, a national supply chain recruiting and executive search firm that recruits across the end-to-end supply chain discipline. Rodney has been working in professional recruiting for many years and has a wealth of knowledge and experiences that he generously shares as our own ASCM career coach. Everybody, please give a warm welcome to Rodney Apple. Over to you, Rodney.
Thank you very much, Dana, and thanks to everyone that has joined the webinar today. Today we're going to talk about everyone's favorite activity as it relates to professional development, job interviewing. So I say that sarcastically, of course. Most people kind of cringe at the idea of going on interviews and meeting strangers trying to make an impression. So today I'm going to talk about ways that you can go out and better prepare for interviews, what to do during the interviews and what to do after. So we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to cover the different types of interview formats, how to prepare for each type of interview. We're going to go through some common interview questions that you can almost always expect to receive, whether it's on the front end phone interview or during a face-to-face interview. We're also going to talk through, common interview mistakes to avoid. And through this webinar, you'll learn what to do before, during, after, how to follow up, and so forth. So quick introduction. I know Dana just introduced me, but for those of you that are on your first Career Coach webinar, I have been serving as the Career Coach for ASCM, formerly Apix, since 2014. We have developed a plethora of content over these years, all geared towards professional development, career advice for supply chain professionals. In a second, I'll show you how to access that material. As Dana said, I've been recruiting for many years, going on 20 years within supply chain management, about 25 years overall. One thing that's unique about my background is half of my career I spent with some very large corporations. Home Depot built their very first supply chain department, supported all of their logistics supply chain recruiting back when they were Fortune 13. Went on to Coca-Cola for about 7 years and led all of their manufacturing recruitment across the country. Had their sourcing, procurement, inventory planning, logistics, continuous improvement, global quality, pretty much everything under the supply chain umbrella there. Went on to Kimberly-Clark, healthcare products, and then Cummins on the automotive side. All of those companies, by the way, when I was there shortly after, have made the prestigious Gartner Top 25 Supply Chain list. They've made it multiple times, actually, each one of those companies. So I've seen a lot of good practices when it comes to supply chain. And I've seen a lot from both the inside and the outside in terms of, how companies, conduct their hiring and recruitment practice. So I've got a lot of different types of perspectives and very much enjoy the opportunity to get to share that with ASCM members. If we're not connected on LinkedIn, I'm always looking to make new connections with supply chain professionals. So there's my LinkedIn handle. Feel free to email me there, rodney.apple@scmtalent.com. We're very active on Twitter as well, at scmtalent is the handle. If you'd like a copy of the presentation, feel free to send an email and we'll get you a copy afterward. As I mentioned earlier, we have a plethora of content that we have developed for ASCM over the years. It truly covers everything under the professional development umbrella, from resume advice to leadership advice, to talk about career paths. I'm not going to go through the whole list there, but if you are interested in taking a look at some of our content, just go to apix.org/careercoach. You will need to log in with your credentials using your password and so forth to access these materials, and you'll be able to find replays of past webinars and we've also got a lot of white papers there as well. For the last couple of years, I've been writing for what was formerly called the Apex magazine, as SCM Now, and so we've got articles that are coming out on a quarterly basis. I've got a screenshot there of the most recent article, and here I'm talking about professional development, and also kind of cover some topics that span on the hiring and recruitment, retention side as well. So if you've got if you look in any of those magazines, you'll run across some of my articles, and again, good advice and tips there that can be found as well. And with that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started. We've got a lot of material to cover. At the very end, we'll have a Q&A, and then Dana's going to talk through a couple of additional benefits on the career development side that ASCM is now offering. So we're going to go through the different types of interview formats. If you've been out on any interviews before, these will be familiar. But basically, you've got your what we call initial screening interview format. Let's say you post for a position, you get a call back from a recruiter or an employer. Typically, they're going to start out with that initial screening. It's either going to be a phone interview, a video interview. That's becoming a lot more common, and in some cases, my wife's in recruiting as well. Her company uses the one-way recruiting. I'm not a big fan of that, where there'll be a set of questions that are asked, and then you've got to you'll be recorded in front of a computer, and then that video will then be forwarded on to the recruiter, and they can basically get a sense for your answers of how you would answer some questions and things like that. They're using that to screen people. And then from there, if the people that they like best, that fit the qualifications the best, they'll invite them in for interviews. So that is becoming, a more common format that we're seeing. And also, obviously, the live interviews, whether it's Skype or a similar tool, those are becoming a lot more common, and also as a means to help, cut down on costs as it relates to interviewing expenses and flying candidates in and so forth. And then obviously you've got in-person interviews, and we'll talk about the different types of formats on that side as well. Most commonly when you look at the folks that you're going to interview with, and I'm kind of speaking to this level, especially for folks that are coming out of college. Most often on that initial interview, a lot of times you're talking to a recruiter or someone in HR. They're not going to get very functional or technical with you unless they've been doing this for a long time like me. But they're typically going to go through the cultural fit, making sure that you're answering fit the basic qualifications that they're looking for, and oftentimes they may go through some of the preferred qualifications as well. And then sometimes, you may not speak with somebody on the HR side. It could be that first call with the hiring manager. And then I've also seen sometimes that get delegated to someone else that could be, a direct report to the hiring manager as well. But ultimately, the goal is always going to be, the same. And it's always remember, interviews, it's a two-way conversation. And unfortunately, there are a lot of employers out there that they don't think that way. They think of it as a one-way conversation where they're going to ask you all the questions, drill you, and with questions just to see if you're a fit. It needs to be a two-way conversation, and if you're getting that sense that you're not getting a chance to ask questions or properly explain your answers, just bear that in mind. It may, that's really not a fair process when it's not a two-way conversation. So anyway, the goal though is to determine if this is an opportunity that is a good fit for your background, and also if it aligns with the type of work that you enjoy doing or that you want to do. Very, very important. You're assessing the opportunity just as much as they are assessing you. And so if it is an opportunity you want to explore further, then your job is to convince the interview that you're the fit and make it on to that next round. In terms of the best way to prepare for an initial screening interview, whether it's a phone or a video or even an in-person, is preparation. You're going to hear me talk about this throughout the webinar. Practice, practice, practice. That is the number one thing that I can, practice and preparation is really the key to improving your abilities as it relates to interviewing. So you definitely want to give yourself time to prepare. If someone calls you out of the blue, hey, you apply to the position, you got a few minutes now. it's best to try to schedule a call if you can. Avoid doing that interview on the fly because you're simply not going to have ample time to prepare. So try to always schedule those out, at least 1 to 2 days in advance, if possible, just to give you that time to prepare. What are you going to be preparing on? Well, it's obvious you're going to want to look up the company, look them up online, and be able to answer very basic questions. What do you know about our company, and why do you want to work here, and so forth. And we'll cover some of those basic questions a little bit later. I would always go through the About page of the website. That's where you typically will find things like the company's history. Look through the products and services. They should have their mission statement. The values should be listed there as well. You want to make sure, that's important. A lot of companies, though, they'll put a bunch of fluff up on the website. And then there are plenty of companies that don't do that. They truly 100% embrace their mission statement and their values. So you definitely want to take times to read through that, because that speaks to their culture, what they believe in, their belief patterns, and so forth. From there, it's real easy to get out on LinkedIn these days and look up interviewers' names by company, and you definitely want to do that. Take some notes as well as you're going through this exercise. That way you can, again, prepare and practice and so forth. You'll also want to make sure that you have all of your, materials organized. I see a lot of candidates take a haphazard approach to preparation and doing things on the fly. They don't get organized. I'm going to talk about what not to do as well here in a minute, because I've seen all of these mistakes and then some. So you definitely want to keep the job description out in front of you. Make sure you've had good time to read through it. I recommend taking a highlighter, going through the job description, and look for. There's a few things you want to look for that should stand out. Again, a lot of companies, do decent job of job descriptions, but many of them don't, and they'll put something together. I call it like a skills-infested job description, where everything just lists out, here's what we want. And unfortunately, they make a common mistake of not really talking about amping up the, what's in it for the candidate. What are you going to get out of this role? What are some of the key deliverables, key objectives what is the value you're going to get? So again, job description, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, but try to find, what is, and this should be listed up in the top paragraph. Sometimes it's referred to as a position overview. But look for those, what the essence of the position is. What is its position going to tackle? Where's the pain points and so forth? Take your highlighter and highlight those objectives, deliverables. You also want to go through some of the core responsibilities. Typically, most companies, not all, will list the most important responsibilities up top. So take your highlighter, highlight those, and then get down into the requirements. And typically companies will have those segmented into minimum or basic qualifications, required qualifications, if you will, that you need to have. It could be X amount of years of experience in a certain area, call it warehouse management. If they do require a bachelor's degree, they'll list that there as well, and so forth, any other special skills. Highlight through that, and then also do that on the preferred qualifications. Get your resume out as well, and I would also recommend looking through your resume and taking the highlighter, highlighting some of the key talking points that align with those core objectives, requirements, and responsibilities. That way you've got talking points that closely align with what they at least have down on paper. And then from there, you certainly want to be able to, ask questions to the interviewers as well. So make sure that you take that job description and do your best to try to figure out what are some of the questions that you want to ask. I would also recommend ranking those in order of importance, because if you're on a call, you've only got a few minutes left, you want to at least go through your most important questions versus, more minor questions. So, what I like, and I like these questions here, tell me about what this person in the role needs to do in order to be considered successful. What does the person need to accomplish in order to be considered successful? That right there gives you a lot of ammunition that you can utilize, for coming up with for your key talking points. What are some of the attributes of top performers that have been in this position? Again, they're giving you the data that you need to speak through. speak to. What have you enjoyed the most about the company? You may also ask, what are some of the things you've enjoyed the least? What kind of challenges could a person face in this role? Those are all questions that you can use, especially if you're invited for the next round of interviews. You can take that information and start practicing and preparing, what you might want to talk about. Obviously, a paper and pen, a glass of water. It's easy to, as you're talking, to get kind of that scratchy throat. So just make sure you've got those things out. And this is super important. These are the things you don't want to happen. You don't want to have any kind of interruptions. You don't want your dog bark. I hear it all the time. Dogs in the background barking, kids screaming and yelling. I've heard people that you can clearly tell they've got a bag of Doritos open or something, and they're eating, drinking, chewing on gum. I've seen it all, and those are turnoffs to employers. So just make sure you've got a quiet environment, no background noise, and you're not doing any of those other things that are turnoffs. Okay, so that's preparation. For that initial screen. This is what you're going to want to do during that initial screen. So try your best, and you have to kind of purposely do this and think about it. But if you can smile, it does help bring out energy and a positive tone to your voice. So focus on that. Avoid fillers. Well, actually, basically, and especially, I've been guilty of this before. You may even hear me do that on this webinar. But you definitely want to avoid those fillers, because it's not good communication skills. I know I've had some folks on our team that I've had to coach when we're talking to, let's say, hiring, clients about candidates, and I hear someone saying actually a number of times. As soon as we get off that call, I'm calling my recruiter and say, hey, you may want to work on, you definitely want to work on trying to strike out that term from your vocabulary. It's easier said than done. It's something you have to work on. Make sure you've got a fully charged phone. I've definitely had candidates drop the call because they were on 5% battery or something like that. Make sure you're in a good area with reception. That means if you don't have good reception in a part of your house, make sure you've moved to a different part. If you have to go somewhere else, find a quiet place. It's very important to have that clear conversation. And when you're wrapping up your initial screen, and of course I can't really give you an advice on what to say during the interview, because I don't know what kind of questions you're going to get. We're going to go through some common questions later. But make sure that you've got the questions on your list answered. Again, it's a two-way interview, not a one-way interview, and you're assessing them as much as they're assessing you. So, make sure if you get to the end and they're trying to, close the call, just say, hey, I've got a few questions. You mind if we can just get through those real quick? It'll give me a better understanding of the position, company, so forth. You definitely want to establish the next steps and the timing. So if you get to the end, you get through your questions, you make sure one of those questions is, hey, what are the next steps in the process of the interview process, and when can I expect to hear back from you? Make sure you make a note of that, because that's when you're going to want to follow up, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. And then afterward, I think it's a good practice. A lot of people don't do this, but I think it sends a positive above and beyond. When you send a thank you email, it doesn't have to be anything long, but you can just send an email that says, hey, thank you for your time today. Really enjoyed the conversation. Maybe bring up something that was unique or that stood out during that phone interview, reference it in that email, and say you're looking forward to hearing back on whatever date that person communicated that you would hear back. So thankful for the opportunity. Highlight the value that you can bring to the organization. Again, express some positivity and excitement about the idea of working for the company, maybe put in, if you did hear that there was a concern, well, I'm not sure if you have enough of, warehouse leadership experience, whatever it might be. Try to come up with a way that you can ease their concern, and I think that email is a good way to do that. And if you didn't quite answer a question satisfactorily, maybe you forgot to mention something, this is an excellent opportunity to put in that information to help ease their concerns. So those are the basics of that initial round interview. It's typically done on the phone, I would say the vast majority of the time, but we are seeing a lot more employers do video as well. regardless of the format, your goal is to get to that face-to-face interview. So what we most commonly see is a one-on-one interview or a two-on-one. A lot of times you'll see one person that's asking the questions and the other person is taking the notes. That's very common. We've also seen panel interviews where you may have 3 or more people in. Maybe they're trying to knock out, they have time constraints, or that's just their practice where you come in and you meet with a broad group of people. We tend not to see this at lower level positions because it can be very intimidating when you're having to sit down in front of a crowd of people and they're all drilling you with questions. You definitely can see this more common at kind of that mid-level leadership roles up into the executive ranks. As we mentioned earlier, video is very common as well. We're working with, let's just say, the largest retailer that's out there right now, and they've got a practice where they do the phone, they do video panel interviews, which I think is unique. And oftentimes they get to a place where they're ready to make a hiring decision, and then that in-person interview is very informal. So just know there's different types of formats there and different ways to prepare as well. Again, when you go on site, you should be meeting with that hiring manager. A lot of times they'll have direct reports. There could be other departments. As supply chain, as it touches a lot of different areas of a business in terms of your internal stakeholders. So it's common to see interviewers come in from other departments. Every once in a while, you'll see direct reports. A lot of times, they may be brought in especially if it's a technical or analytical type position, and they need somebody if the hiring manager is not super strong on the analytical side, they may bring in a direct report to assess that individual's background when it comes to analytics. Again, goal is going to be very similar. It's a two-way. You're looking to see if this is a good fit for you, and vice versa. So the goal is to convince the interview why you're the best, and move it either to the next round or move it to a job offer. And in some occasions, you may say, "Yeah, this position is not the right fit for me, or I'm not bonding, or I don't really like the person I'm interviewing with." So, this is your chance too to opt out of that process if you don't feel like it's meant to be. Some of the things you can do to help prepare for face-to-face interviews, obviously you want to take what you've learned from that first interview, and that's why it's so important to ask those questions on that first round. What does it take to be successful in this role? What are the key attributes of a top performer that's been in this position? Because they're basically giving you the answers they want to hear, and then your job is to go back, pull from your background the most relevant and significant accomplishments and experiences and skills, and talk about those, because that's what's going to get them excited. You also want to look out on Glassdoor. Maybe look at their Facebook page, their LinkedIn page. Don't just look at their website, but look at other sources where you could find some good information that you can leverage for that interview. Glassdoor, one thing about Glassdoor is, and this is the same thing with Yelp and other sites, a lot of people that do go out and provide, comments or feedback. Maybe they haven't had a good experience. They could be disgruntled. They could have been fired. I mean, there's many reasons why somebody might go out and put in a negative review. But you want to just take that for a grain of salt, but also look for information where they may get into, the type of interview format, the type of questions, and so forth. So just wherever you can get information and different perspectives, you definitely want to look at those sites beyond the website. Again, make sure you're looking at the list of interviews that you're going to meet with, and so forth. In that phone interview, if you did your job and asked the right questions, you should have a good understanding of what the key objectives of the role are, the challenges, and so forth. So take all of that information, and then it's all about the value that you delivered, and make sure it's relevant and significant towards that position. You may have seen this format before. We used this extensively when I worked at Coca-Cola, or Coca-Cola, Home Depot, Kimberly-Clark. We used that STAR process. And what that stands for, it's an acronym. It stands for, it's a way you would tell a story. It's a pretty natural way to tell a story anyway. Well, tell me about a time you had to do this or that. And usually it starts out with, here's the situation. It could be, here's the project I was asked to lead, here's the problem, here's the challenge, whatever it might be. It's that front end part of the story. So you're going to kind of frame that up, and then from there you're going to talk about the task. What was the task at hand, and get into that. What were the core action steps, if you will? And then the most important part of this is what was the final result. So you're talking through a story framework, starting with whatever the problem or the situation was, what you personally did to solve it, to lead the project, and then the final result. Another process I've seen is another acronym for everything in supply chain, right? It's CAR, challenge, action, and result. So you can think of it from that standpoint. Both are very similar, both accomplish the same things. What I would recommend doing is to practice with a friend, a colleague, go through, maybe just draft some sample questions from the job description. If you have to, get in front of a mirror and practice. There's a new app that we've been using. I think it's called Otter, and you may want to download that. It's a free app. They have a paid version too, of course, like every other app. And it's pretty neat. You might want to, it records your voice, but it also transcribes your voice into words. So you can just set it, start it, and start asking questions. Or maybe you have a friend that's asking questions, and then go ahead and go through the answers. And I think this will be a great test. You can go back and listen to yourself, obviously, and you can also look at the words, the sentences, paragraphs, as well. And I think that's a fantastic way to kind of measure yourself. Are you getting into the weeds? Are you saying some of those actually, basically? That's a fantastic way to catch yourself, because sometimes those are subconscious and you don't even catch it. So Otter is the name of the app, and I think it's great to download for practicing purposes, especially if you're having to practice alone. But practice telling the story, because that's what interviewing is. It's storytelling, and make sure you can convey the answers in a way that you're kind of stretching on that border of not enough detail where you don't really get into the meat of what they're looking for, and you definitely don't want to be on that other side either. That's even worse, where you're taking 20 minutes to go through an answer. You can look at the interviewer and you can tell you're losing that person when they start drifting off into space, or they start looking out the window, or they look, especially if they look at their phone, which would, that's kind of rude to do that. But make sure you're striving to find that perfect balance. I always like to answer the question and then follow up right away and say, hey, was that enough detail for you? Is there anything you would like for me to clarify before we move on to the next question? I think that's a great practice as well. Dress to impress, making sure you've got the right attire. When in doubt, it's always best to overdress, guys, suit and tie. Ladies, you probably want to, dress in business attire as well. But I also think it's very appropriate to ask your recruiter or your point of contact, your interviewer, hey, before I come in, I just want to make sure that I'm wearing the appropriate attire, because there are some companies that dress down and coming in with a suit, maybe in a factory environment or a warehouse, you could stick out like a sore thumb. So it's always best to ask if you can, and when in doubt, just go ahead and overdress. So when you go on an interview, obviously you're going to, bring copies of your resume. Now, they should have it. Somebody should have taken the time to prepare interview packets for the team, but in some cases that doesn't happen. Again, you're going to have a list of questions that you're going to want to ask the interviews. I want to make a note on this too. Don't go into each interview. Let's say you've got 5 different people you're interviewing with. You don't want to go in with the exact same questions for each interviewer. They're going to think, he asked me that too, or he asked me that question. And when they're going to get together after the interview to have a debrief, to talk about you and how you did with the questions and the general feedback. And, it's best to have, it's okay to reuse some of the questions, but look at that person's profile on LinkedIn. Let's say you're speaking to someone about, a marketing person, try to get into their head. What do they care about? Maybe it's somebody out in operations that they brought in. What do they care about in that factory? And try to customize your questions around that person's, functional or technical background and so forth. And it's okay to also, especially when you're trying to think up of, if you've been around for a while, you've been around the block for a while, you should have a lot of experiences you can talk to. And sometimes in an interview situation, you get a little nervous, anxious, and you forget. So use that notepad that's got your question. Maybe write a few trigger words just to help jog your memory for accomplishments and things that you want to talk about in particular, so you won't forget. I think it's a good idea to have a reference list. Sometimes you might be asked, and you can leave that behind. These are optional, but if you've got a letter of recommendation that's a great one that speaks highly, and especially from a like an executive or a former manager, then it doesn't hurt to bring those, attach those to your reference list. And in some cases, especially if you've been if you've got some projects that relate to the position you're interviewing for, here's a caveat, make sure it's nothing confidential that your current employer would not want you sharing. But sometimes it's good to bring in some examples or a project portfolio just so you can kind of showcase, some of the relevant or significant work that you've done that relates to that job you're interviewing for. Obviously, you want to be there on time. Always recommend trying to arrive 10 to 15 minutes early. Even recently, we've had some candidates that were late, and they called us. I said, well, thanks for calling us, but you definitely want to reach out to your point of contact there. We'll do that as well, just to make sure that we get the point across that you're going to be a little bit late. And just make sure you do that. It's very important. Showing up a few minutes late and acting like it's no big deal, you definitely don't want to do that, because that's going to send kind of that negative connotation. One thing that's important, I think is extremely important in the supply chain profession, is supply chain is all about creating and sustaining value at the end of the day. And so it's very important to be able to relate the value that you did for your employer, not just relate it, but also be able to quantify those results. So think about, if you saved money for a company, well, what was that number? And don't just be able to talk to the number, but how did you get to that number? How did you know you saved that amount? Or how did you know you increased a certain KPI by a factor of 10%? Make sure that you can, quantify and then speak to how you calculated that. I have seen this one guy, Home Depot. He was a VP of transportation, and he was super analytical, Wharton MBA grad, very, very bright guy. And I've seen him just eat people alive in an interview situation when they start talking about, they have these big numbers on their resume, and he would go just not drill them, but he would just dig and dig and dig and say, well, how did you get to that? And if you couldn't get to that, that was the end of the interview. So make sure you can articulate, how you got to those numbers, dollars, dollar signs, percentages, and so forth. Never make any estimates or generalizations. Like I said, it can be painful if that interview starts to dig in. Other things you want to do, always be professional. Just know that your interview starts from the moment you arrive into that parking lot until you leave that parking lot. Heard a horror story the other day where I guess somebody couldn't wait to go to the bathroom, and they found the tree out in the parking lot and relieved themselves, and then someone happened to see it from the office, and that person, as you can imagine, did not get the job. You want to be courteous to every single person you meet. I've heard horror stories. Someone comes in, is rude to the receptionist that greets them in the front office. I don't care if it's a massive company with 10,000 employees. You want to be courteous, because if you don't, it can certainly get back, and oftentimes it does. So strive to make a great impression. Obviously, a smile, firm handshake. There are studies that show oftentimes hiring decisions are made in the first few minutes of an interview. So if you make a bad impression, if you don't have a strong handshake, you're going to have to practice on that, because it is a turn off when you shake someone's hand and it feels like you're grabbing a fish. They call it the dead fish handshake. The opposite of that is the death grip. You don't want to break someone's, fracture their hand. So somewhere in the middle is just fine. Firm is best. Make sure you get a business card. That's always a professional thing to do, but also you want their contact information so you could follow up. Body language is key. You want to make good eye contact, but at the same time, you don't want to stare them in the eyes the whole time. That can create some awkwardness. Make sure you've got posture. You're not leaning back. You're sitting straight up. Keep your hands still. You don't want to have your knee jogging up and down. I know it's easy to get nervous. Don't cross your arms. That's going to send it's a negative behavior. So don't do any of those things as well. Maintain that positive body language. Very, very important to make that first impression as well. So when you wrap up your interview, and again, I can't, give you advice on questions right now. Not knowing what you may be asked, that could, go on for hours and hours. But when you do wrap up your interview, again, you're going to want to definitely ask about. One of your questions should be, what's the next step in the process, and when, as far as timing goes, what is the date that I should expect to hear back? Don't let them generalize that either. It should be in a couple of weeks. Well, so would it be on, by May 30th? Is that what you're saying? And try to line them up on a date. You're going to go back and mark that down, and that's going to be the date that you're going to follow up if you don't hear back. Again, if you feel, if you sense, even if you don't hear, but if you sense that one of your answers didn't go so well, you definitely, this is your chance. Could be your last chance to address that concern in terms of the ability to perform on the job. If they feel like one of your skills might be a little bit rusty, it's a good chance to say, it's rusty, but here's what I've done in the past to overcome that. I will go out and take some courses, some classes. I've got a person that's a guru. I'll see if he'll be my mentor or whatever it might be. That's a chance to address those concerns right there. So always ask that question at the end. Is there anything that you feel could prohibit me from performing in this position? This is key. I've seen so many candidates that they just sit there like a knot on a log, and they actually did well. Let's say there's two candidates, all things are equal in terms of their qualifications. They're both neck and neck. Well, if that one candidate expresses interest, like, I really want this job, can I have this job? Just simply asking for it can put that person above the other person that did not. So if you are interested in the position, ask for the job. Make sure you extend your gratitude. You definitely want to be thankful for the opportunity to interview. And again, when you always want to take good notes because it's easy to forget, especially when you go on a series of like 5, 6, 7 interviews. Maybe you've got multiple interviews that week. It all starts to blur together, at least it does for me. But make sure when you get back to your car, write down the most important points, address any concerns, questions, follow-up questions that you might want to make. And then from there, you're going to follow up after that interview. Write, thank you notes, extremely important. Whether you do it email or snail mail is up to you. If you're interviewing somewhere in your backyard, it's pretty easy to go get some thank you notes and drop them in the mail that day or the next day. If you heard that they're going to be making a decision very quickly, you may want to send an email. I like to I'd like to, err on the side of sending an email, because with snail mail, you never know what's going to happen. If it does arrive, it could sit into the post. If it's a big corporation, it may sit in the mail office for a while by the time it gets to the interviewer's desk. So just bear those things in mind. I like the idea of referencing something unique or something positive that you experienced during that interview. It's another opportunity to express your interest in the position. And obviously, this would probably be maybe your last chance to go over any type of concerns. If you sense something or you heard something, they don't think you have this or that, this is a good chance for you to talk about that and try to overcome, mitigate their concerns. I like the idea of connecting with your interviewers on LinkedIn. So make sure you craft a personalized invitation request versus sending over the cookie cutter. I wish LinkedIn wouldn't even let you send over that cookie cutter, because it's always nice to just put in a quick little note. Enjoyed meeting with you last Friday. Very interested position. I'm looking forward to hearing back from you soon. In the meantime, I'd like to connect on LinkedIn. And that way, even if this doesn't work out, you've got a new connection, and then you can try to, I've seen people that didn't get the position. They made a favorable impression. They're active on LinkedIn with posting and sharing content that's valuable. It catches the eye of a past interviewer, and they get hired into that company. Maybe it's a year, 2, 3 years later. So don't just rule out, oh, this is my one and done chance. If I don't get this, this is over. I'll never work there. That's baloney. If you try to make a meaningful connection, and if you don't get the job, hey, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. I'd love to be considered, for a position there in the future. Leave the door open, never shut it. Follow-up practices. I'm not going to, go through this word by word, and I'll leave it up here for a second. You can kind of get the gist of it. But this is kind of a routine that I would recommend that you would go through. Let's say you don't hear back by the date that you're supposed to. I always recommend picking up the phone. That's another good way, for them to hear your voice. It's a more personalized than an email. Keep it upbeat, keep it enthusiastic. But you want to call and follow up. Hey, I heard, the gist of it is, obviously you haven't heard back. This is important though, if you are leaving a voicemail, hey, I haven't heard back. I was told that I would hear back by this date. I'm still very, very interested in the position. And this is the key part. I will try calling you back on, let's say it's 3 to 5 days out. In the event I don't hear from you by then, that puts the ball in your court versus saying, please call me back at this number. I look forward to your call. So it's a little bit easier when you're telling them, hey, I'm going to try you back if I don't hear in the next 3 or 4 days. And that puts the ball back in your court. So always use that approach when you're following up. You've got to, let's say you don't hear back by that 4th day or whatever it is. This time, do go through the same process. Leave a voicemail, and then you're going to want to follow up that with an email as well. And then, again, wait 3 or 4 days. If you don't hear back, I would try it a 3rd time. Oftentimes that 3rd time you get through. And then there are some companies, unfortunately, that just ghost, and we're hearing a lot about that on social media. But if you don't hear back by that 3rd follow-up, it's going to be your call. There's too many factors involved. It's only you can make that determination as to when you want to follow back up. You may want to try it a 4th time or a 5th, especially if it's a role that you're very, very interested in, and maybe that they're just taking time to get through different rounds of interviews. So just use your best judgment there. Some of the common interview questions that you're going to get, especially when they're during these initial phone interviews, is obviously tell me about yourself. Now, what all do they want to know? Well, they certainly don't want you to go back into, well, I was born over here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and went to school here, and I graduated here. If you do that, that's not good. So they really want to just get a quick snapshot of who you are. I would even practice this. You can call it your elevator speech, if you will, where you're able to convey, here's who I am. Answer those basic the who, how questions. Be able to articulate those in about 30 seconds to a minute. Always try to slant that towards the role they're looking for. Let's say it's a transportation position. I got out of school, I majored in transportation engineering, and I'm very passionate about it. I knew from that point forward of graduating, that's what I wanted to do with the rest of my career, and kind of go down that path. You try to want to make sure it aligns with what they're looking for, not just in terms of skills, qualifications, but their cultural fit. Maybe go back to their values, mission statement. If that's aligned with your belief system, then you can kind of talk about those things as well. Share what makes you unique. Keep this answer short and sweet is the best. Once you start dragging it out, you're going to lose their attention. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? I've heard this question countless times throughout my career. They just want to know that they're not looking for a 5-year plan, right? You can't just crystallize, okay, in 2 years I'm doing this, 3 years I'm doing that, 4 years I'm going to be doing this. It never works out that way. They just want to make sure that you've put some thought into your future when it comes to your career, and you're not just looking for a job. So make sure that you've got some forethought there and that you can answer that question depending on what your career interests are. Obviously, if it's your first job, you'd like to maybe talk about, well, here's what I'm looking for in a career, and I'd like to progress to this level at some point. If you've been in the game for a while, you might, you could certainly, talk about, a value. Again, that's what everybody cares about is what kind of value have you delivered. So always go there when you can. What's your greatest weakness? Again, this is one of those questions where they don't really care about the weakness unless it's something detrimental to the position, of course. They're looking for, because everybody has opportunities, everybody. And if somebody says, I don't have any weaknesses, they're going to look at you like, come on, that's not true. So you want to minimize that weakness, though, and jump right into emphasizing what you have done, the steps you've taken to overcome that weakness. We call that lessons learned. And again, don't focus on a weakness if it's critical for the position. I'm looking for strong analytical skills. I'm not that great with Excel. Okay, that's not going to get you very far. Other questions, why did you leave, your last job? Just remember, if it is something that's negative about the employer or the manager, speak from a high level. Don't go into detail. Don't get angry. You don't want to dwell on those negative experiences. It's best to kind of focus on what's leaving you to look for an opportunity, and so forth. Why should I hire you? And I've seen people completely botch this question. You certainly want to focus on the value. Again, I'm going to use that word value quite a bit, but the value you can deliver, but never come across as a know-it-all. I've seen people do that. It's always a turn-off. But again, talking about the more relevant and significant accomplishments will get you far in the interview process. So always focus on that. Common mistakes. So we talked about bad-mouthing former employers. It's happened to us recently. A candidate that we put in front of a client, they just went off into this rant about a former employer. When they called us to tell us, hey, we're not moving forward with your candidate, that was it. They were just talking so negative, and they just think that would translate over into their environment. And nobody likes a complainer. So even if it was a super awful thing, quickly reference it and move on. You don't want to dwell on it. That's when you start dwelling, is when you get into trouble. If you're asked how you dealt with a horrible boss, again, keep the answer short, and just try to keep it as positive without dwelling into those negatives. I've seen candidates do this too many times. You get into the interview and they say, well, what questions do you have for me? Well, what's this pay? How many weeks of vacation should I expect? What kind of benefits do you have, and what do they cost? When can I get promoted? Those things are important, but you want to try to refrain. You want to get into questions about the job, the position, the company, the career paths, things like that. They want to hear that you're interested in contributing to them. You're going to get these answers, but your number one goal is to get the offer before you start getting into those me questions. So that can be a turnoff. Again, we've talked about arrogance and know-it-all. You don't want to come across as being cocky. Don't forget to quantify your accomplishments. Again, supply chain is about creating, sustaining, enabling value. So make sure you can speak to that. Also, I see a lot of candidates make this mistake, using we versus I. When you use we, it seems like you're the subconscious thing that's going to happen is they're going to think, well, who all helped you accomplish that? So you always want to lead in with I and focus on what you did. And it's okay if you had team involvement, but they want to understand what you did when it comes to solving that problem or challenge. Don't ever show up without a notepad and a list of questions. I have even myself interviewed people for my company. What questions do you have for me? I don't have anything. I'm just very interested, and it just seems like you're not prepared, you're not showing interest, and you're not serious. It also can convey, I'm just looking for a job. I'm not really looking for a long-term career. And most employers are looking for somebody that's going to come in and grow with them. Don't keep your phone on. When I interviewed for our first marketing position, I couldn't believe it. I was asked in the middle of a conversation with this candidate, and her phone rings. She reached to her backpack and pulls it out and answers the phone in front of me. And needless to say, that didn't go to the next step. You don't want to be too aggressive in your follow-ups. I know it can be easy to get impatient, but don't call them and ring them 10 times a day. You're going to come across as a stalker, and no one wants to hire a stalker. Never make assumptions you've gotten the job. I've seen this happen before too. Let's say you happen to know the interviewer, they're a neighbor, and you go in there and you just try to coast through the interview. I've got this. You never want to go in with leaving that. It's the impression you're leaving, those signals that can, it's just going to lead you to the door, and it's not going to lead you to getting in the door. It's going to lead you out of the door. That's it. I'm going to turn it over to Dana. She's going to talk about a couple of additional career benefits through ASCM, and then we'll jump right into the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Rodney. Real quick, go ahead and type in your questions using the toolbar and click send. I'm seeing a lot of great questions coming in already. So in addition to Career Coach webinars, ASCM offers many other valuable career resources. Be sure to visit the job board under the Learning and Development header on ascm.org. As an ASCM member, you get access to new jobs posted 4 days before they are open to the public. Your profile will also be highlighted to show you're an ASCM member, showing potential employers that you place value in professional development and advancing your career. The 2019 Supply Chain Salary and Career Survey Report is now available for download on the ASCM website. More than 1,700 supply chain professionals were interviewed on topics such as job functions, benefits, work-life balance, and career satisfaction. We are happy to report that supply chain professionals love their jobs. Don't forget to explore the salary calculator to see how you compare to your peers. These are only a few of the items These items are only a few of the valuable benefits available by ASCM to help you advance your career. You can find the full list on ascm.org. We're also very excited to welcome Rodney Apple back next month for our members-only SCM Live webinar. SCM Live webinars provide added insight and information about articles from SCM Now magazine. Check back frequently to see which SCM Now magazine authors are speaking in the upcoming events. In this edition, Rodney will discuss how to uncover the hidden supply chain job market. Look for this and other upcoming webinars on the ASCM events page. Okay, so let's dive into some questions here. First up, let's see. Give me 1 second. So if you have a panel interview, how should you send the thank you email? Is it one to each person, or maybe grab a key contact and send an email to that person?
That's a great question, and I think it's best. I don't think I would want to send one email to the entire team, because typically in a panel, it's a panel interview. It's made up of a cross-functional team, typically, not always. But I always believe in a thank you note is a one-on-one conversation, and it's best to address that individual. Try to pick up cues in the interview, especially if one of them asks you a question. If you can mentally jot that, or remember, or at least jot that down, like, wow, this person asked a great question. Or maybe you had a really good answer and they're smiling, they're shaking their head up and down. So it just gives you an opportunity because you don't want to send the exact same thank you note individually to every person on that panel. This is your opportunity to shine and tailor it towards that person. Let's say it's a cross-functional team. Maybe you've got manufacturing, somebody does finance, somebody does logistics. So it just gives you a chance to kind of speak to their, what they care about the most. So I'd always recommend sending a individual thank you note and then customize it based on that person's background, or maybe based on some of the questions or some of the talking points that you had.
Okay, great. This listener wants to know, what type of questions can you ask to understand if the company really believes and lives their mission statement? How can you get a sense of what the culture really is like at this company?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think as you go through the day, this is a place where you can ask the same question, right? So I would frame up a good question, and it can be 2 or 3, maybe different questions that you ask across the different interviewers that you're meeting with. But getting people tend to like to talk about themselves. As a recruiter, that's one of the ways that we accelerate our learning in supply chain, is to simply get on the phone with people and ask questions. So asking questions, maybe a little bit more personal about their work. What motivates you to get up? What do you like about working here? What are some of the things, if you had the power to change, 3 things at this company in terms of improvements, what would they be, from a cultural perspective? So I think that asking for some positives and then asking for maybe some, you don't want to ask for, well, what do you hate about working here? You don't want to frame it up in a super negative manner, but I do believe that if you can ask a question that leans more positive and more negative, but also when you go in there and you're taking your notes and questions, write down those values and, mission statement and so forth, and maybe have some questions that slant towards those values. And I think that's a good approach. And then doing it across the whole interview panel, that ought to give you a pretty good perspective. And as we talked about before, getting out on Glassdoor, again, grain of salt. People tend to, if they're going to leave a negative review, sometimes it's the people that had a really bad experience. Maybe they weren't the right performers. So always take that for a grain of salt and just use it as a data point. Another thing you can do is reach out to people that work there. Let's say they're in the position that they work in a similar position or department. After your interview, I call these informational interviews, but maybe reaching out, hey, I just interviewed for at your company. I met with several people, and I'd love to just kind of pick your brain. I had a couple of questions. I wouldn't get into what those questions are, but maybe having more of a kind of an informational interview. Those are all tactics that I think are great for getting like a direct perspective from the interviewers, but also maybe getting that indirect perspective from like an employee that works there in the company. So that's what I would recommend.
Okay, great. Here's a good one. Supply chain jobs also include some leadership positions. What are some of the questions that can be asked about one's leadership capabilities, and what are some possible great responses to this question?
Okay, so trying to get a sense for, let's say, the person you're interviewing for, what are their leadership attributes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Let me think about that. So, that's a super good question, and I think what I would do is get a sense for their, there's a few things here, but what is their style? You certainly want to understand, what their style is, and so you can talk about, well, how do you set the vision or the direction for your department or your team? How do you cascade those goals? I think that's always important. It shows to me that they've got strategic thinking abilities, and they can go rattle that through. Like, well, what I do is take the core goals from the company or cascade it down to us. I sit down with my employees. I would also ask, what are the things that if you ever had an employee that, let's just say they weren't coming up to speed fast enough, what are some things that you did to get that person back in line? There's a whole series of questions you could ask here, but I think in general they're going to get to those attributes of have you had any problems? How did you overcome them? How do you cascade the goals down to your teams? When someone steps out of line, let's say they're not performing, have you ever had that happen? And what have you done to overcome that? And I think from the answers perspective, you just want to hear that they care about their employees, and you don't, and when it comes to leadership, barking orders, well, I just told that person that if you don't do this, you're fired. That's not the kind of person you want to work for. You want to work for a nurturing leader, someone that thoroughly cares about developing their teams. And I think putting those kind of questions together to get to the meat of that. It's hard for me to just rattle off those questions. I have to put some thought into this, but that's where I would start. Is just framing up questions that get to their leadership style. How do they handle difficult situations? How have they handled that in the past? And you want to hear answers that are just positive, nurturing. They lead from out front. All of those classic core leadership attributes that make a good leader. But when you start hearing anything negative, well, I put them on a PIP, right away. A PIP is a performance improvement plan that you have 30 days to either make the improvement or not. Those things are good for problemed, people that have had a series of incidents where they're not hitting their performance goals. But if you hear that, like, well, that's what I immediately did, or I threatened their job, I gave them extra work. If you hear anything negative, that's usually not a good sign. I hope that answered your question. Feel free to email me separately if you like. Just kind of let me know. I'll put some more thought into that, and I can probably clarify that better. But that's where I would start.
Okay, great. I think that's about all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our speaker, Rodney Apple, and all of our attendees for participating. We hope you found this webinar to be beneficial. Please be sure to keep an eye out for future webinars on the online events page of the ASCM website. This concludes today's webinar. Have a great day, everyone.